I have young people, artists come to me, or not only young, but all ages, and they'll say, well, I used to paint realistically, but I got to the bottom of it, and that's why I turned to abstraction. And I often think to myself, yes, they got to the bottom of their own depth of character, but not to the subject.
Andrew Wyeth has been painting for over 50 years, but he works in only two places, here in Maine, this is his summer home, and in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania, where he was born. His pictures are amongst the most popular in America and command some of the highest prices, and yet the people and places he chooses to paint are usually deeply personal. Her room is his wife Betsy's sitting room, and the painting grew out of Wyeth's anxiety about his son making a solo boat trip upriver. It was painted 17 years ago, and yet one of Wyeth's latest paintings is set in the next door room. The Wyeths use it as a dining room, but it's an old schoolhouse which they moved from another part of Maine. It's a sparsely furnished room, but full of textures. The painting is realistic in tone, but it manages to convey many Wyeth obsessions. There's a strong suggestion of people, although there are none in the painting, and a sense of mystery and even witchcraft. It's called Witching Hour. In its restraint and understatement, it's typical of many of Wyeth's greatest works.
Everything that I've painted were places where I had experiences, and I'm very much feel very strongly about the personal element of what I paint. I think that's really the whole quality of my work, to go deeper into something that I know intimately throughout my whole life and try to pull it out. My father came here in 1903 to study under the illustrator Howard Pyle, and he fell in love with this country. And of course I was born here. Pyle had a class of about 12 students. My father was one of them. And they call it the Brandywine School. It's actually the Howard Pyle School, really. It was an illustrator's haven here. My father did the classics, Stevenson and James Fenimore Cooper. That's very remarkable father in that he believed that he knew I was going to be a painter or an artist or an illustrator. He wasn't certain, but he often said, it's so important for a child that is going to be creative to have a life alone. That's why he was against college education for a painter. After all, you gain all your experience you may spend the rest of your life on between the age of, say, 6 and 18. And I certainly did. Still to this day with me, Christmas has a strange aura. For instance, our stockings, which we hung on the end of the post of our beds, we were made to go to bed early, my brothers and sisters. And it was a terrifying experience because old Chris, as we call him, St. Nicholas, was to me a terrifying man. He was a big man. I saw him several times, which was my father dressed up. And I remember when I was about 8 years old, 7 years old, lying in bed, I couldn't get to sleep. And all of a sudden I heard footsteps on the stairs, and this figure came in in white fur with little lights blinking on and off. And I could hear it, and I crawled under the covers, and I could hear him filling the stocking. And there was sort of bells as he walked down the stairs. And I was terrified, to the point that I wet the bed. This, to me, this is a type of thing that he did. And I remember one year this was about a week before Christmas, we were sitting in the living room, us kids, playing on the floor. I think I had soldiers out. And we heard stamping of feet on the top of the roof. And down the chimney, through the flue, we have an enormous chimney in the house, came this amazing painting of the head of Santa. Well, my father almost fell off the roof, almost killed himself that day. Because he's a big man. He weighed almost 300 pounds, my father did. He'd gone up there. I just tell you that story, that how he believed in exciting our imaginations. My other brothers and sisters were off at school or studying art, and I was left alone, although I had tutors in the morning, and the rest of the day I was free. This is before I went into the studio under my father. So I wandered these hills and these woods and the brooks and the country and really got to know it intimately. I made up my own stories of what was happening around me. These hills became Sherwood Forest, the English countryside, or the battlefields of France. All these imaginary things floated through my mind. I can look at those soldiers and remember the names of practically every one of them. I much preferred to play with them by myself, make up my own stories. King Vitor's the big parade has had a strong influence on me. It's interesting that the part that impressed me as a child still holds. The scenes of him leaving by truck and going to the front, that French girl trying to find him in the crowd, and the motion of the trucks and the gun carriages going and her figure there. I thought it was very dramatic, leaving her lone figure there against that rather painted background, but interesting what you can do with almost nothing. Long line of trucks, and it was leaving to the front. My interest in Koerners really started as a small boy because of my interest in the First World War, which I was born just as Americans entered the war in 1917. And finding Carl was a machine gunner in the German army. And of course I knew his kids and played with them. But his telling me stories, it fascinated me because there's a strange mood, even though Carl's now gone. Very Germanic. There's a feeling of could be in Austria, the Black Forest, those trees in front, those the spruce and pine. He planted them from small examples from the Black Forest, where he was a sheep herder. But he wasn't just a Pennsylvania farmer to me. I mean, I'll be there alone in that house, and all of a sudden a shot will ring out. And it's Carl maybe hunting deer, or maybe he was just target practicing. And you'll go into his house and you'll see these rifles slung on the wall. There's a military feeling. There's something more than just a farm.
Andy, you know, he talked to my father about the First World War, and Andy was so interested in the foreign of the First World War, and my father told him a lot of the things that had happened, you know. My father was on the front lines, and, you know, when you're on the front lines, there was no turning back. And it pretty near got fighting so close that they, you know, used hand grenades, and actually they got pretty close there a few days. It was just firing, you know, into the enemy there within maybe 15 to 20 yards. They were getting close. And he says many a time tanks came by, they've tied 2 and 3 hand grenades together and throw it into a track of a tank and blow it up. Blew one track off. One tank went around the circle all afternoon. Yeah.
To be in that house alone, and the marvelous rich smell of sausage cooking permeated the air.
The hooks, well, they're mainly for smoked hams, or farmers make their own sausage. They smoke them in the chimney, and then they hang them there and season them, let the fat dry off of them, and we'd make all kinds of meat, you know.
I felt so strong about the ceilings and the hook, and I worked on that, how I was going to do him. I made drawings of him in profile. I made drawings. I worked on quite a long time, and then one day I realized, oh my God, I must look by his head up to the ceiling. I want to get that feeling that you might even be talking with him. Maybe you're going by him to those hooks, which also to me expressed his rather Germanic power, sharpness. I wanted to get it to the essence of the man. I felt that he was more like a U-boat captain than a farmer with his black collar and that severe, and then those iron hooks. I think it disturbed him a little. He said, why don't you paint me with my snowdrops that he loved? He had a very sentimental side, as most Germans do. He said, that's awfully severe. But this is the way I felt about him, and actually I was right, because he was severe.
That was a courageous picture. That was that picture, and you look at my father, it's he's putting there, and you're looking at him, you think he's alive. It was something.
I learned a lot by that painting. I hadn't done any portraits up to that time, and I lost my father in an accident right near where Kerners lived. And I regretted so that I hadn't done his portrait. I'd done impressionistic watercolors of him sitting in the rocks and things like that, but not really done him. And Carl reminded me of my father in many ways. Carl was a much more Germanic-looking man and shaved head and that, but they've both had that tough quality, Germanic power. And I realized that here was my father still alive. And when you think actually it was my first real portrait.
when the steam train or the milk train went down. He got hit there one day. Was something that was very sad. But we heard the whistle every day, but that day they said nobody blew the whistle.
I think that it changed me from just painting pictures into painting a reality with an edge, with a meaning. His death really gave me a meaning to paint. It's a strange thing. I knew he meant a great deal to me, and we had a marvelous time together, and he was terrific, not just as a father, but as someone to talk to, And I think having him taken away so quickly and abruptly, it really jolted me. And there's quite a change if you look at my work from then on. Up to that time I did many watercolors, which are very brilliant in color and flashy, dramatic, and full of a lot of swish. And then when you look at those and then all of a sudden look at the portrait of Carl, I think you have to have a reason in a creative painting to doing a thing. And his death gave me a terrific reason. Then I did one called Winter 1946 of a boy running down the hill, which is related to the whole thing. See, I aimed to stay around that location of where he was killed. It took on a strange quality of color to me, mood, which I still retain to this day. And I think that if you look at the paintings of Kerner's of mine, you'll begin to sense that it's not a quaint farm where they work in the garden and they milk their cows. When they slaughter a pig, it's brutal. And I was attracted by this. It's always cool to go in the summertime into a milk shed like that with that constantly running water from that spring up on the hill. And the trickle of that water. There's something awfully brutal about the thing, although it's a charming farm interior. But to me, there's something else there that fascinated me. And then the snow on the distant hills, the cattle out in the courtyard. The sound of those animals' hoofs on that cement to me is the most shattering quality. And these are the qualities that I was after in the thing. You think of harshness, New York City in the nighttime with cars going by or something, but the silence of the city. Well, this is the silence of the country. I thought that's some of the best painting in it, I think, the cup, that almost transparent feeling. You notice the cup is still there, isn't it? I saw the light in the window. Carl was, Kerner Sr. was ill at the time, and that light was on late at night, although I saw this in the early spring evening. I guess it was March, I think it was done in. If you notice, in the watercolor, there's little buds coming out on the trees just before it breaks. And the dampness of the dam with the overflow and a certain rich succulence in the thing that I was after, and that stone white building reflecting the moon coming up as you notice the wall of the house. I've left out some windows because I wanted to bring that feeling of reflected light.
She's one that don't bother anybody, my mother, you know. She's a person that's coming into a new country wasn't that easy, you know. Mother speaking German, couldn't speak English, but she was fortunate. Her brother came over, but still she was homesick to go back. She settled pretty good. She has her good days and bad days too, you know. There's certain days won't let people come in. She's not feeling well. I let her do what she wants. She keeps that barnyard, that's her enjoyment. If I stop her, it would be the worst thing. She would probably go in the house, start to cry, and I'll take her work away from her. She cooks pretty good. She knows that's her main chore, and learned that from the old country, and she does that very well.
I saw her there, and I made some drawings of her, just little rough sketches, and then I walked up on the hill, walking home, and I sat up there, and I began to think of that kitchen way down below in that place. And that's when I began to dream about what I wanted. I wanted you to feel the enclosure of the building, and yet the country outside. Carl was off at a farm sale, but there was his place set. It's more of a portrait of Carl than almost than him being there, you know. Knives were very important to him as a man. I mean, cutting up animals, and he always carried a knife with him. And I think there was a fork there, but that didn't interest me. Because I wanted to express this man, this real person. You'll notice my pictures are very strange. It's as if you're almost floating in the air looking on them. Well, that, I think, is caused unconsciously by the fact that I don't work from a location. I make drawings in all directions. I know what perspective is, and I try to keep my perspective fairly true. Fairly true. But it's certainly not accurate perspective. I think I worked on it for about 5 months, that painting. The table wasn't in it in the beginning. There was a dog. His German Shepherd dog was down in the corner. Mrs. Kerner was in it for a while. Great transition, that picture. The log outside of the window with that tooth like the fangs of the dog really became the dog so that I could eliminate the dog. I realized that I was overtelling my story, because there were the sharp teeth of that German Shepherd. And then the sunspot. The day I put that in, hitting on the side of the wall, really did the trick.
We always enjoyed deer hunting every year, going up Pennsylvania mountains, and it kept our eyes, sharpened us up a little bit. He enjoyed it very much. He was a hunter all his life, and being in the First World War, he was a pretty good shot.
Well, I'd worked on his figure in that for, well, actually a year and a half. I kept going back and working on it. And then I thought, well, I'll put these trophies, because that's the room I did it in. And one day Mrs. Kerner came up, Anna Kerner came up and said, in German, I could understand, she said, "Why didn't you come for dinner? I called you." And she looked at him severely. And he spoke back in very harsh terms. And I thought, oh my God, there it is. That's a whole portrait of their life, with his rifle aiming right toward her, blow her head off. And I'd already painted in a moose head, which was lousy. Didn't work. So I sanded it off, which became part of the wall, as you notice. And she posed for me. I was there at the right moment. Imagine if I hadn't been there. But you see how important it is to be in a surrounding and breathe it, and then it happens, if you're lucky, and you're perceptive enough to catch it. I mean, what would Moose's head done in the picture? Nothing. Chaddsford's a rather indistinctive town, a big concrete road going through the middle of it, and a Sunoco gas station. But it's what's behind that that's important. Our mill is where Henry Knox had his artillery station, and the British charged across there. Their leggings got so muddy in the September Brandywine stream, which becomes very muddy, that their beautiful white leggings were so muddy that they stopped at the mill, broke in. The mill had been closed. They broke in and got flour and stood in the courtyard and coated themselves with flour, their leggings. I always wanted to do a painting of it. These scarlet coats would be fascinating, I think. But you see, all of this, I may do a weed in the field, or a dead crow, or just leaves under the ice. All of this, I know all of this background, and I sense all this. People will say to me, I don't know how you can paint in a place that has split level houses and these high wires of the Philadelphia Electric Company going across a landscape. Actually, it doesn't bother me, because it's something much deeper than that I'm after. I'm not here to record this day and age. I'm only recording what I have felt about certain things. And it amuses me now that it's growing up a great deal here in this valley. I see other artists painting the country, and trying to do great simplicity, but this is no longer here. I still feel it because it was part of my life, but it's grown up now. I mean, you can't go up on a hill here and not look off and see a building development. I work a great deal from memory of my childhood is what I'm trying to say. In fact, I've one of my paintings that called Snow Flurries of a hill. It's a portrait of a hill that I'd known all my life, walked over it. Well, I heard that a building development was going up on it. And that charged me to do it as I see it before it changed. And it was a very moving thing to get it down clear with all the power and simplicity you can do. I grew up with a young colored boy who I played with for years. He was really my closest companion as a small boy, lived over the hill. And he was remarkable. And I found he had great imagination, much more than the white boys I knew. And I never thought of him as black. And it's funny, I've never had any feeling about, I know a number of years ago they wanted to show the State Department to Russia of my paintings of Negroes. And I said I wouldn't do that, because I didn't paint them because they were black people. I painted them because they were my friends. And I've always felt that the blacks have been painted very poorly. I'm not saying that I've done it well, but I think they've been caricatured. Big lips, big eyes. They have a dignity of their own.
We got along the same as sisters and brothers. In this place you call Chad's Ford, we got along the same as sisters and brothers. Yeah. Well, I've been around here, like I said, ever since 1913. I've never had no trouble with nobody. 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 And when my old rooster out there crows, that means time to get up. That's my clock. I don't need no alarm clock. He starts around 4 o'clock, and you can take it from there. Yeah, it used to be about 150 colored peoples around through here. Then, when I first came around, there was that many people. Most all these houses you see around here, a lot of these houses you see around here, the colored peoples lived in them, but the white peoples bought them and remodeled them. And some of them were tore down. Most of them, practically all of them died, and one didn't die, they moved away. Yeah. Winfield and I is the only ones around through here. And they painted a lot of colored people's pictures around here. A lot of them. Well, Andy, again, he's been good. He was good to the colored people.
This was a young lady that I knew in Pennsylvania. She said she would pose for me if I didn't show her face. And a remarkable looking girl. She had blue eyes and a very handsome figure. Negroes have a if you've ever looked at them close, have a strange dry quality to them. Their pigment of their skin. It's very interesting. It's not shiny as people. I think they've been exaggerated in paintings. The sheen on a Negro. There's quite a dry quality to their pigment, and that's why I felt it was perfect for tempera. He'd been around here living in my studio for a year. I'd made a lot of drawings of him to get through to this man who was a remarkable man that had a little problem of drinking wine. Well, one morning I came here and I could tell by his lips were sort of damp, you know. And I started drawing. Actually, it was right in this spot. I took this piece of paper and I was sitting there and he came up and he sat and drew his chair up close and he was fascinated by what my hand was doing. He got sort of hypnotized. And I finally did his eye, and I did the portrait of him just here, looking down. And that's how that happened. And if you'll notice the wine, the dampness of his lip, and there's a slight smile, quizzical. That's dry brush, but there's some also free washers to show through. Dry brush happened to me very unexpectedly. I found after doing hundreds and literally thousands of watercolors, I got to be sort of bored with just wash. And unconsciously I began to build into them. After my wash is very freely done, I began to add texture with smaller brushes of texture of grass, texture of the skin, or texture of the tree bark, and build them stronger. But only over a very free wash of absolute abandon. Watercolor, you see, supplies me with being out of doors, almost shorthand notes. Tempera is a long, drawn-out thing of slowly building a great excitement when you got this germ that you feel could be something. Tempera color, if you've ever looked at the pure pigments that I use, the beautiful qualities of color. Some come from India. Wherever I find a deposit of color, even some came from my brother-in-law's ranch, a beautiful ochre, and you keep it in jars with distilled water, and then you take it out and mix it on your palette with the yolk of egg, just the yolk, not the white. And you'll notice the way egg will stick to a plate when it dries. Well, this is what happens to tempera on a panel. Once it dries, you can take a scrubbing brush and you can't get that off. It's tough. But it takes about 6 months to dry. To me, the appeal of the main is, I think it's utter simplicity. There's no large business here, I mean factories and things like that. But the people that live here work off the land or the sea. The Finnish people, whom I've painted a great deal, came over here to work in the quarries.
Yeah, he has a love affair with the Scandinavians anyway. I think he likes them. I used to help him a great deal, and I had a dory rowboat, and I'd row him around these islands, and also he took up temper at an early age, and in them days it hadn't been refined too much, and you had to have it on a glass panel and grind the color with another piece of glass to mix it, to make it smooth. And I used to work for him. In fact, I had a job every summer to do that besides posing now and then.
I think Walt was around 13 or 14 when I first knew him. But he'd come over to the studio and go dig clams. He's a wonderful boy. And then I began to paint him in watercolors. I did one of my earliest portraits of him. I didn't look at him as something picturesque. He's just full of the devil, and we spent more and more time together. He's actually my closest friend up there.
Ralph Klein, oh, I knew him very well. He was an old wood chopper, and he had a sawmill. He ran a sawmill for many years. He loved the thing he did. And that was mostly wood, in the wood business, and that was the thing he loved. His wife used to have to get after him to come to supper, 10 o'clock in the evening before he'd leave the mill.
I couldn't believe it. Here was this living image of one of these men that I'd dreamed about, gone through this whole campaign. And I went to his sawmill, and I said, I want to do a portrait of you in your uniform. And he looked at me a few minutes, and he said, sure. Where would we do it? And I said, well, is there a place? Yep, right up above here in this room in my sawmill.
Dad was proud of that uniform, and the fact that Andy wanted to paint his picture in it was quite a lot to Dad. Some of the time I'd be sawing while they was up there painting. Took most all summer. Seemed to use last part of September when they got it done, and Dad was afraid Andy's eggshells was going to freeze, you know. It was getting kind of cold up there. I don't know, there's quite a pile of eggshells there when he got through. So he must have mixed them right on the job. Dad was quite a hand to keep going. He did sit still there an awful long time for him. You can see that he was tired. I could see it because I knew Dad. I could see it in his eyes, that strain.
He told me about all of his experiences as I painted. I was congealed in an atmosphere. I felt like I was in France. The dark room I painted him in with just one window, and the gloom behind him of these heavy timbers became the Argonne forest. I brought him cigars, and the smoke of the cigars around him became the smoke. It was an amazing experience.
I think he caught that drive and determination that Dad had. Dad was very proud of it. Dad was pleased with that job.
Did I tell you what he said about Carl Turner, who was also in the German army? And Carl said one day, he said, you know, he undoubtedly shot at me and I shot at him. And I told Ralph what Carl said. Oh no, he said, if I'd shot at him, he wouldn't be around.
Olson family. We had a farm. They had quite a farm there years and years ago. Elvira and Christina, her brother. Someone said they were Germans, but I don't know if they were or not. They were the original old settlers. Carried on the parents, same strain of work. They kept to the same thing, fishing and farming.
Well, it was near the sea and faced out of the section where I'd spent a lot of my boyhood. It was an unusual situation of a brother and sister that lived in this remarkable house. And she was a great friend of Betsy's, my wife, who had known her as a little girl, which was a great opening for me. And first I didn't have a studio at that time. We were building a house in Cushing. And I asked the Olsons whether I could use one of the upstairs rooms, which was deserted, and I did, and that was how it all started. For a number of years, that's all I painted in Maine were the Olsons. I could just pour all my thoughts. My imagination ran free because the house was full of, to me, ghosts of the past of New England. I mean, it was unbelievable. They were seafaring people, the Olsons, Scandinavian. Several of their ancestors had dropped off of these square riggers when they were furling their sails at sea, lost at sea. And it was it just one of those natural things. And I finally was able to paint Christine. I only did one portrait of her brother. He didn't want to pose, but she became, to me, everything that I ever had dreamed about of New England. But also a very dear friend, very intelligent woman.
Yeah, she was a beautiful woman. I think, if I remember right, someone said she, at an early age, she had polio. And I can see her now going up through the field. Many years ago, she'd go way down in the end of the field and get an armload of wood and crawl way back to the house again. Unbelievable. Unable to walk, paralyzed both legs. Pull herself with one arm and carry a bag of wood with the other, all up through the field.
I saw her crawling out to a little truck garden she had next to the house one day, and it dawned on me, what terrific, I mean. And I went home that night. I remember there was a small party being given at the James's house, and I remember in the middle of the party I rushed out into a room in the studio that I had painted in and kept my material and made a quick notation of this idea of Christine, the field, the house in the background. And several days went by and this kept building in my mind. I worked and worked and worked on just the field, that swell, that curve of the field. It's like building a house and then living in it. I built the ground, thinking of her. And then when I put it, it was right. It just electrified me, you see, because I'd worked for months on this feeling of that pelt of the grass. And then finally, and I purposely held myself back for that moment. You know, timing is so important in painting when you do a thing. If you restrain yourself to the right moment, and if it can be the right moment, it makes all the difference in the world. I knew she had been to my up to look at it, though, because I could see where the dust had been swept along with her body as she crawled up. So she knew what I was doing. That pink, like faded lobster shells that you find on the shore there.
I think in a sense she was quite hard. The condition, I think, made her that way. But she was a wonderful woman, you know, to talk to. She was something he wanted to do, you know. He did several paintings of her. It was just something that he saw and said, I just have to do this. You know, the old farmhouse and the way she lived. And I think Andy's sometimes amazed that people can survive in the condition they might be. Like her with no legs and, you know, crawl on your stomach for 65 years and do your own work in the kitchen.
We had a marvelous time together. Sometimes we wouldn't say a thing for hours, and then we'd talk. She felt very easy with me, and I think enjoyed it. But there again was that communion of what wasn't what was said or what wasn't said. It was amazing when she'd turn around and look at me, you know. It's very knowing quality. Very. She was quite a person. They liked me in a very real way. I mean, they didn't have any great, they didn't show any deep respect for me. They knew I was busy, but I wasn't anything unusual to them, which I don't want to be. I often feel if I could only be not there to paint, just a pair of eyes, would be so marvelous. I mean, I'd be working on Christine and Al would come in, step right in front of me and get eggs. I mean, as if you know, oh, Andy, there he is, sitting there. You know, which is just right. It's like walking in a landscape. Not to be there so that you can see these animals looking at you. If I could just do something and disappear and just be terrific. Christine said I'd go anywhere as I wanted to, and I went up these dusty steps up to the 3rd floor. And I went into this room, and it was an August day. And it was very stifling hot. There were dead flies on the windowsill, and it was very still and very hot. So I went over, and I lifted the window, and all of a sudden, this frayed curtain that hadn't been any wind in there, air in there for probably 25, 30 years, lifted slowly, raised off the... I realized, my God, fantastic. That was that split second that I saw these frayed end sort of shivering in the wind. I mean, it wasn't a gale blowing outside. It was just sort of like a ghost lifting this thing off the dusty floor. And then it fluttered for just a few moments. I didn't get a west wind for a month and a half. But in that whole time, my imagination kept working. And I made drawings from memory, and then I finally did get a west wind. But the whole thing was in my imagination. I mean, I saw that happen, and I realized what a terrific, I felt cold chill go up the back of my spine, you know. I'd been out sailing. I came in, went up the steps, went into the room upstairs, and I was shocked by seeing this figure standing. And I realized it was a dusty mirror. It was me. And I did this picture. Strange part about it, when I was half through it, Al came up one day and he said, let me dust that window, that mirror, so I can see it better. I just stopped him in time. 40 years of dust. It was a moment that I felt was seemed to express the way I felt about the house and the feeling of the ghosts of seamen that had long since gone. That's why I call the Revenant the return of something ghostly, you see.
I knew that once they died, that place would change. I felt Christine was getting very old and decrepit. Her brother was dying of cancer. I wanted to do a portrait of the end of that house. Not just a painting of a house, but a portrait of a house. Each window expressed certain periods of Christine's life. Her bedroom above with the torn curtains she hadn't been in for 25 years. Down to the sitting room with the, if you look in the original, you can see the hanging lamp, which you could pull down on a chain, Victorian. All these things were the history of the Olson family.
I painted that window so minutely that I took Betsy's binoculars and drew it from the binoculars, because each one of those rags and old homespun linen were very interesting to me. There's one piece of pure blue cloth. It was marvelous the way that's stuffed in there. That has a marvelous feeling.
Each clapboard is absolutely a portrait of that clapboard, and there's one which is white. And Al Olson took that from my house, which I was having re-clapboarded, and he said, "Can I have that? I want to patch it." And it's in that painting from my own house. That's a bucket that he would take slop out, and he would always come out and walk down that path, you can see, towards me, and set it down and talk with me. It becomes more than a camera shot, because all the years that I knew Christine, it's a distillation of all those thoughts, trying to be put into one thing. See, that's what an artist can do if he feels the thing strong enough. It's your memory as it is, past, present, and future. Now artists say to me, "Well, why don't you use cameras the way we do now?" I mean, the artists go around with cameras and shoot things and then paint them from the studio and from the photographs. I said, I don't do that because the very fact of sitting in a location with an object, the spirit slowly, unconsciously seeps in. I may never look at the drawing again. I may take it home and into the studio and throw it on the floor. That's why a lot of my drawings have my foot marks from them. I may not ever refer to it again. But what I've gotten from the experience of being with the object lifts it beyond photographic realism or just a cold object.
They died pretty close together. I think he went first, if I remember right, and then she did. I'm not positive there.
I've had so often, when I'd been painting, I would hear Christine and Al Vera's voice. So like a funnel would come up and come up that chimney. I could hear it. Everything they said just clear as a bell. It's one of the few pictures that were actually painted right there. Up in the attic, looking down on the end of the kitchen into that chimney coming up. That's the last picture I did there. The bottom dropped out really, and then Siri came into the thing. She was sort of a rejuvenation of me as far as something young, vital, intense. Quite a contrast to Christine. Betsy had known her as a little girl, and I'd seen her along the road with her marvelous Finnish father with this bald head, very brown, amazing man, carrying her when she was about 6 years old. And then I met her when she was 12. And then Christine died, and it was a sort of a rebirth. I think she had a more secluded, rural upbringing than most young ladies. And this appealed to me very much. It was like finding a young doe in the woods or a young moose. It was just a marvelous, fresh, untouched child when I found her. She was still very much a virgin and wasn't conscious. And I finally became just a pair of eyes watching this remarkable thing. Where she stood there with the sun hitting on. It was amazing. One morning when I was drawing her and beginning the painting, I had drawn it in and was working on the thing like mad. The sun came out and hit the top of her head through the little lights above the doorway, barn door, and it just electrified the thing. And it passed. The sun came out and then disappeared, became dark. And then it would come out, and I had to work with lightning speed to catch that momentary flicker of gleaming gold of her hair. I had no idea of putting sunlight on the top of her head, and it just happened. It was, of course, it made the painting. It's those hidden qualities which, after working on a painting, whether it's from your imagination in my studio or in an attic or in a barn. I worked on the Virgin, for instance, of Siri. I was always delighted when maybe on weekends, she would go to town to shopping with her family, and I'd be left alone. Then I was free to expand the thing, change certain things without even the personality of her around. So I could dream about it. That's why I feel, I'm, as I said before, I change things terribly from what is really truth. Where with a camera you can't do that. The camera has its other quality, but painting to me is a matter of truth and maybe your memory of what it is. And finally, if a painting is good, it'll be mostly memory.
You mentioned that I have the looks of Robin Hood. I gave him the appearance of a last breed, I guess.
I think, too, might have come into it was the fact that I had this hip operation, and here was someone who was the prime of physical condition and youth. It fascinated me. Here I was, crippled. Of course, we always paint ourselves or paint what we wish we were. I'm really painting my own life, my own doubts, purely a personal expression.